This is you can show my screen. This is published actually same moment that Herschel Walker HuffPost kerfuffle happened. March 16th, 2022 in the British Medical Journal. That's what BMJ stands for, British Medical Journal, yeah. An op-ed by two researchers called The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine. Subheading being Evidence-Based Medicine has been corrupted by corporate interests, failed regulation, and commercialization of academia, argue these authors. And let me just read this paragraph, which for some reason I've only highlighted all but the last line. The philosophy of critical rationalism, advanced by the philosopher Karl Popper, famously advocated for the integrity of science and its role in an open democratic society. A science of real integrity would be one in which practitioners are careful not to cling to cherished hypotheses and take seriously the outcome of the most stringent experiments. This ideal is, however, threatened by corporations, in which financial interests trump the common good. This is not antithetical to what Desmond is arguing. It sounds like it might be, but it's not. He does not argue that there aren't possible financial interests that are doing bad things in the world. He's just saying you don't need that in order to see mass formation forming. Back to the op-ed. Medicine is largely dominated by a small number of very large pharmaceutical companies that compete for market share, but are effectively united in their efforts to expanding that market. The short-term stimulus to biomedical research because of privatization has been celebrated by free market champions, but the unintended long-term consequences for medicine have been severe. Scientific progress is thwarted by the ownership of data and knowledge because industry suppresses negative trial results, fails to report adverse events, and does not share raw data with the academic research community. Patients die because of the adverse impact of commercial interests on the research agenda, universities, and regulators. So that came out 2 weeks before the Together trial was finally published. The ivermectin the Together trial was finally published, but it's rather in keeping.
So it actually is an excellent place to make a particular point.
Great.
We tend to think of. Actually, I've been fighting this battle a little bit since back in Game B days. When we say something like capture, right? Capture, which is now a common phrase since COVID, is a common phrase in most people's minds. Capture is a reference to an earlier phrase, regulatory capture. And regulatory capture was a much narrower phenomenon than what we mean when we say capture, right? Capture is a very general phenomenon. It involves the capture of university professors. It involves the capture of newspapers. It involves the capture of all the things that sway policy ultimately. And the regulators are one. That's one core thing that you have to capture in order to get ahead through this sort of mechanism. But anyway, the point is, the proper instantiation for the concept is not the specific one, because if you say, what's going on as the result of regulatory capture, then people only see the regulators and they say it's not a big enough, that couldn't be doing this. And the point is, no, zoom out, right? This is extended capture, as I think I've called it before. And unless you instantiate capture as something in which regulators are included, but it is not limited to them, you won't understand its power. And so likewise, the concept of corruption, right? Corruption. Is corruption about bribery and financial incentives? It certainly includes that, but it can include lots of stuff. It can include prestige, right? There are lots of people who will be persuaded by prestige. As you will remember, I used to argue about what golf junkets were doing, why lobbyists were taking their clients on, or clients is the wrong term, but their targets on golf junkets. And there was one instance in which there was a whole lot of prostitution going on one of these golf junkets, and it emerged. And it struck me that essentially, look, you want to figure out the two most powerful incentives that you can use to persuade at least men are going to be money and sex, right? And so a lobbyist who can figure out how to provide sex to somebody in a way that they get away with it, that their spouse is none the wiser and all of that, has a very powerful tool. You know, we could figure out what the equivalent value is in money, and it's very large, right? So anyway, the point is, corruption isn't about bribery. Bribery is a version, right? And in any case, what I would say is, you have to instantiate the system that the corruption of the system in terms of the incentives. What incentives? whatever incentives persuade people. It will include that full set, right? And unless you're looking at that full set, then you will only have a partial picture of why people do what they do. So, the authors there are arguing about financial incentives, and Desmond is saying maybe it's not limited to financial incentives. And you're right, they're the same story. The question is, how narrowly are you zoomed in, right? Incentives persuade people. Ultimately, all of that stuff is driven by a system built to put your genes into the future, which none of these people are talking about, right?
Yes.
Bribery is proximate to gene spreading, and gene spreading is now crazy because lots of people are engaged in regulating their own production of offspring, and so they're interrupting the very process that would unfold, that their extra power would give them extra reproductive opportunities, which they're now not using for reproduction, right? But nonetheless, in what way will people be persuaded? Every way that they can, right?
Right.